Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Anarchism read-through of Manufacturing Consent by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. This incredible book. Today we are talking chapter 1. This is the first of the chapters that we're going to break down, and that means that we're talking all about the propaganda model. This great model that underpins the rest of what's to come. So it's important that you understand kind of the context that this chapter is going to set out, and it's going to give you some grounding for what's going to come next. It's probably the most academic chapter in the book, and maybe a little bit the most difficult to read, but it's probably the most worthwhile. It's going to give you a foundation that you're going to use for the rest of the book. So it's very, very important to understand this. Now, if you haven't already, I recommend you go back to the first introductory lecture, which gives you a little bit of grounding in who Herman and Chomsky are, a little bit of the historical basis that we'll be talking about, not in this chapter, but later in later chapters to come. And it's also just going to give you a little bit of an introduction to the book, how to read this book properly. And so I think that introductory lecture could really help if you're just jumping in here. And I should say, before we jump into it, if you want more stuff like this, check out the Champagne Anarchism Patreon. You can find that all of this main feed stuff where we talk about the books in this reading series is completely free over there. So you can go join the group chat over there. It's been really, really cool to do this project and to talk about these books and to get a lot of feedback, especially on social media. That's really, really cool. So I really appreciate people kind of engaging with this. I think it's really awesome. And I'm just going to keep doing it. So let's get right into it. The breakdown for this chapter is going to be pretty simple. We're going to follow what Herman and Chomsky set out, these 5 filters that make up the propaganda model that they say are used to guide and shape media coverage in such a way that it aligns with the interests of the powerful. And those 5 filters are size, ownership, and profit orientation, advertising, experts, Flak, and anti-communism. The point that they're making here and throughout this entire book is often that it's harder to see censorship when it's not formal censorship. So private media groups that compete with one another, they aren't obviously colluding to produce one message. And that's significant because you may live in a society where there is formal censorship, where the government will get involved in censoring media and trying to drive a particular political message. But this is not the case in countries like the United States where they're writing about, and they say that that's almost more pernicious because you don't see it. You assume that the media companies that are delivering you this kind of content are competitive, that they're above board, that they're reporting the truth, or at least a version of the truth that just sort of adheres to the facts. And that's not the case, or at least that's the argument that they're putting forward in this book. And so the propaganda model is going to show us how these filters, these 5 filters that aren't formal censorship but are informal ways of maintaining this media message, how they operate. And by the way, in this chapter, you'll see a little bit of data analysis, some interesting charts. Don't skip those. I would take a look at those tables that they set out here just to kind of understand the context. Now, we will talk about this, but the world has moved on since 1988 when this book was published. We're not living in that world anymore. We're actually living in sort of a more advanced, more accelerated version of the world that they were talking about. So when they talk about things like ownership and concentration, well, that was absolutely true in 1988, but now we live in a world where there's actually even more concentration and more billionaire ownership over certain huge media properties. Think of Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. And I should mention, I'm recording this video in 2024. If you're watching this from the future, maybe things have gotten much, much better. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to get into all of that, but we have to break down each of these filters in turn first. So the first filter is size, ownership, and profit orientation. This is basically where they look at the literal structure of the news organizations that are producing the reporting that we're going to be looking at in the rest of the book. And they begin by talking about the work of academics Curran and Seaton, who look at the emergence of a radical press in the first half of the 19th century. Now, what Curran and Seaton say is very interesting because they say that the early attempts by the government to quash this radical press, they failed, but what didn't fail was the market itself. So the market, better than any crackdown ever could, managed to crush this radical press in the early 19th century. Just because scale and capital costs rose and the radical presses couldn't compete, so the customer base shifted. There was a huge centralization then that followed. Now remember how we started out this lecture talking about the differences between informal and formal censorship, right? You may try formal censorship, but the informal way of just quashing dissent through market means may be actually more effective. So what the radical presses in this example learned is that they literally couldn't compete with bigger media groups who could attract more customers and had these massive capital investments that they just couldn't compete with. And so the radical press kind of withers away because it's not meant to do what these very powerful and very costly competitors can. And so Herman and Chomsky, looking across the media landscape in 1988, try to break down the centralization that they saw happening at the time. They bring out these statistics, they talk about the TV news and the reach of various networks, and you will recognize a lot of the names that they bring up. But what you have to understand about this particular part of the book is that this has only gotten worse. So in the present day, for example, there's a statistic that's thrown around a lot that 90% of media outlets are controlled by just 6 companies. When you look at this in terms of general media consumption, we're not just talking news here, that's a little bit of a different thing, but general media production. Those 6 companies are Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Paramount Global, which used to be Viacom CBS, Sony, and Amazon. Now, the first 4 produce a lot of news. The second 2, Sony and Amazon, much more entertainment geared, but still very much in the media space. And when you come to news as well, we can't forget about News Corp. News Corp runs things like Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post. This is Murdoch's outfit, and it's multinational as well. That's the other thing about News Corp that we should mention here. And so this tremendous consolidation that is happening in 88 that Herman and Chomsky are really concerned about has only continued through time. And now looking at it in 2024, you see this tremendous withering away of local news organizations and the rise of things like Comcast, Warner Brothers, Disney, obviously, the News Corps of the world. And I should mention as well, before we get off this point, that you also have PE companies. So these are private equity companies that come in and their whole business model is to buy up kind of distressed media companies that are in a little bit of a tough position, and they essentially strip them for assets. So companies like Fortress Investment Group, for example, or Alden Global Capital, these are very famous for going in and buying up small papers or small media properties, stripping out the assets and loading them up with debt, and then either holding on to them or offloading them as kind of much diminished little outlets. So that's exactly what happened to kind of titans that used to exist. Places like the Denver Post or the Chicago Tribune. USA Today had the exact same thing happen to them, actually. And then when Herman and Chomsky are talking about ownership as well, this has also accelerated. So as you read this chapter, keep in the back of your mind that now a lot of the big media properties that that are everywhere, that even I kind of think left-leaning liberals tend to consume a lot of, things like the Washington Post, are owned by Jeff Bezos. Lorraine Powell Jobs owns the Atlantic. All over the place, you have the billionaire class, either through ego or through a shrewd application of this idea that if you can own the news, you can influence how the opinion of the world looks at the companies that you run. They come in and they just buy up a property. It's honestly fairly cheap. And in the case of the Washington Post, that was a very, very struggling paper before Jeff Bezos came in to buy it up. And so he could almost present himself as this white knight coming in to save journalism. And then also, we should remember that as hands-off as these owners want to present themselves as being, they're not really, right? They're always out for their own interests here. And Herman and Chomsky talk about this. We saw this example, by the way, with Jeff Bezos, with the the Washington Post's non-endorsement of Kamala Harris in the last election. So we know that Bezos intervened to get the Post to not actively endorse her as a candidate. And that's a big deal. And Herman and Chomsky tell us a little bit about why that is. So they break down these kind of family-run media conglomerates. And they say that if it's a family that's running this, it will be typically an absurdly wealthy family with a vested interest in protecting what they have. Big media businesses as well will also have close links with banks and other financial entities, right? They need these financial entities to just keep running their normal operations. They will need loans, for example, consistently just to keep running their operations. And then Herman and Chomsky go a step further, and this is very, very interesting because they say media companies themselves also operate a large range of non-media companies. And if you take their examples and transpose them onto the present day, think about companies like the New York Times, which operate Wirecutter. Wirecutter is a reviews business. So they will get a ton of money from this team that just goes out and reviews products and recommends those products to consumers. And when you do that, you are attracting a client base, but you also, through your main reporting, can't really alienate them because then that's a major stream of income that will be cut off to you in the future. Then think about places like Vox, which has a deal with Netflix, branded content, which appears all over the place. So big media companies will have business interests of their own. They will have business links that they can't afford to sever, and they will have oftentimes kind of big business-oriented or wealthy owners as well. And that's what makes this maybe the most powerful filter that we have. Because while there may be interesting reporting happening, the incentive is just not really there for that reporting to see the light of day, or to have the prominence that it deserves, or to have the depth of analysis that it deserves, anything like that. Just literally off of this first filter. The second filter, however, is just as important, and that filter is advertising. So mass media has an interest in attracting audiences with spending power, not audiences per se. That's a crucial insight, actually, because you can bring a bunch of people to read your paper, but really what you want is actually a big number of wealthy people. If the people reading your paper or your radical press or whatever it is tend to be poorer people, tend to be working class people, whatever it is, they just won't have the spend that you can then turn around and say to your advertisers, look at all these wealthy people who read us. If you advertise with us, that advertisement gets shown to these wealthy people with the purchasing power to go and buy your product. That is very, very significant. And actually, one of the things that I recommend doing is going and pretending to be an advertiser and checking out what some of the offerings that places like the Financial Times or the Economist or any of these business papers they tend to be, which are geared towards kind of wealthier readers. What are they saying to people who may advertise with them? And what you'll find is that they'll say directly, we write for wealthy people. You know, the people reading The Economist are movers and shakers and wealthy business people, and you can put your advertisement in front of their eyes, and that's a significant draw for an advertiser. So often we talk about audience statistics, but that's not what really matters for this advertising filter. What really matters is the type of people who are reading. Now, what does that mean for the actual reporting? Well, it means that reporting should never alienate those wealthy customers or those wealthy readers. Herman and Chomsky, for example, cite the example of a WNET TV station that ran a documentary that was critical of corporate activities in the developing world. And because they ran that documentary, they lost Gulf Western as an advertiser. They also reference an NBC documentary about the environment that didn't end up attracting sponsors, even though those sponsors were quite happy to spend on corporate ads, on environmental ads. So they're happy to mount an ad campaign about how great their environmental credentials are, but they won't want any programs out there that deal with real complexities. They want to be able to guide the message. So the advertising filter really has two parts to it, right? First of all, you don't want to alienate the advertiser. That's what happened with Gulf Western. But secondly, you also don't want to alienate the reader. You have to attract the right readers, and if those wealthy people tend to be business people, you won't want to write anything anti-business. That's just not a good strategy. And of course, secondarily, you don't want to write anything that will alienate the types of companies that want to put their content in front of your customers. And so think back to the example of the radical press. The radical press almost exists to piss off those types of advertisers, the corporate advertisers. And they also kind of exist to alienate that customer base. And is it any surprise then that they won't necessarily be able to compete with these kinds of big corporate media outlets? Almost definitely not. Right, now let's turn to that third filter, which is sourcing. Sourcing, I actually know a lot about because I worked in this space for quite a while. What Herman and Chomsky say, which is absolutely right, is that news bureaus will often concentrate resources where news breaks. So that means police stations, halls of power, business bureaucracies. They will focus their journalistic resources on these places, and that makes it very easy to control a news outlet. Because who controls those spaces? Well, the police, those in charge of the halls of power, or those businesses maintaining those bureaucracies. And all of those sources of power maintain extensive public relations operations. So PR people, last time I checked, outnumbered journalists by about 7-1 in the United States. And that is a ridiculous number. And the way that PR works is it effectively subsidizes the news business. So Herman and Chomsky say they write communications in easily printable language. So you as a journalist will often get a PR report that you could just copy sections from, paste into the article, and not worry about anything. That comes straight from the company. How could they be wrong? The PR people will also manage contacts for you. They will schedule press conferences for you. They will generate material around the journalist's schedule. This happens all the time. And so it means that they can really effectively guide the message. And if you want to break out of that, it costs quite a bit of work and time and effort to find the right sources, to find the right contacts around this PR infrastructure, because everything is pushing you in a certain direction. The other thing Herman and Chomsky note here, which is absolutely dead on, is that once you have a regular source in a business or a government bureaucracy or a police station or whatever it is, it's very hard to call that source a liar. It's very hard to turn around to them and say, this isn't true, because this is a developing relationship. This is an ongoing thing that you have to maintain. Just as they have to give up a little bit of flow of information stuff to you so that you have something to print, you also have to make sure that you're framing their words in a way that's not going to piss them off and mean that you can never go back to them again, because then the person right next to you is going to go to that same source and get the story that you no longer have access to. And that is why Herman and Chomsky say powerful sources can threaten access in exchange for favorable coverage. Often when we think about this, the word access journalism is thrown around. So you write favorable stories because you then are given the keys in. You are given these inside scoops and these really interesting and quirky stories just because they know that you're going to report the story the right way, or the right way for them anyway. And it is very rare to find a journalist who can actually break out of that system. And this is why, by the way, I really hate a lot of political journalism just in general, because it does tend to be necessarily this type of access journalism, and it just drives me insane. This also matters a lot, by the way, for financial and business news and just the quality of expert that you normally get. So if an expert is quoted on television or in a printed story, often that expert has been vetted by those powerful people and put in front of you. So an expert economist, for example, will often work at a bank. A crime expert will typically be a former cop or federal agent. A political expert will have worked in politics for somebody powerful or have been somebody powerful before. All of these structures that we've built in this society that we all live in, they're set up to maintain that power structure. Finding an expert outside of those carefully pre-selected people who will be sent off to talk to the press is incredibly difficult. Also, we have to think about this from the journalist perspective a little bit. When you're facing 7-1 odds with the PR agency and you have deadlines coming up and you are only one person and can't really turn around that much material very quickly, you don't have a lot of time to yourself to do the type of reporting that you would necessarily like to do. You just have to put some kind of product out there. There's a lot of time pressure. You are not paid as well or nearly as well as the PR people who are paid an exorbitant amount of money to make sure that you only see one side of the story. A lot of this is just in this system because there is no way to break out of that system. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you don't have incredible journalists out there doing great work every day. Of course, these people exist. However, they are rare, and they are also increasingly a little bit hard to find. We do have to talk about the fourth filter, which is Flak, or I suppose put properly, it's Flak and the enforcers. So any kind of negative reaction is kind of a way to control a media source, or a media outlet, I should say. So this can be organized letters, this can be lawsuits or the threat of lawsuits, legislation, it can be punitive actions. All of these can kind of silence a media outlet. Remember when Peter Thiel took on Gawker, for example, and just crushed the organization through the legal sphere? Something like that can absolutely happen, right? As a media outlet, you are always kind of up against the wall, and the wrong story can provoke a negative reaction. And listen, I'm not here to necessarily defend Gawker, but I would defend its existence quite happily. But one wrong move can provoke a lawsuit or a bit of legislation or some type of massive reaction that could potentially bury you. And that's especially the case when it comes to a smaller press. The whole idea here is just to literally raise the costs of dissent. The final filter here is anti-communism. And this is one that's very much a relic of the time in which this book was written, right? 1988, we're talking very, very much Cold War mentality here. Anti-communism and the crackdown on communism becomes just another filter. We could extend this potentially to something more kind of talking about patriotism now. We could say anything that's perceived as unpatriotic, as not sufficiently supporting the mission of the United States or the values of the United States, whatever it is, that's going to provoke a massive backlash and enough reaction against the paper that publishes it to make sure that these kinds of stories never see the light of the day, the light of day in the first place. So communism, Herman and Chomsky say, is the final monster for classes with property. And they're not wrong. And even today, anything that kind of smacks of leftism that they think has gone far too far may get sort of self-censored under this model. And that brings us to the end of this chapter here. And I think the filters themselves are quite self-explanatory. And it's definitely worth reading this chapter and kind of going through the examples and seeing a little bit of the data analysis that they pull out. We're going to talk about these filters in much more detail as well as we look further into the examples that they use in the book. And I'm very excited to talk about the next chapter, which deals with a lot to do with El Salvador, which is a really interesting history. But it's worth asking yourself, kind of as you read this chapter, is there anything that you would add to these filters, to these 5 filters? Is there a 6th filter that we could put in there? And I would just have you think maybe a little bit. I mean, could we add, for example, a pro-police filter? Right? Think about the ways that the military-industrial prison policing complex has infiltrated our media. And I'm not just talking news media here, because everything from Hollywood to TikTok is kind of infected with this pro-police bias. And anything you say against the police or the prison industrial complex or the military, right? We got to support the troops. That could easily be filed under there. Is it worth as well? Think about this. Is it worth adding maybe an economics filter, right? The way that we talk about debt as a morality tale, the way we consider everything through the filter of how do we pay for this? This, by the way, is how we justify things like austerity politics and our kind of broader crackdown on the poor and the welfare state. We ask ourselves in every single context, how much will this cost? And we know, by the way, there are plenty of economists who will say, rightly, that a budget is just a moral document. A budget shows you the priorities of a nation. It's not necessarily tied down to any particular balance sheet. We don't necessarily need to worry about the cost because when it comes to a country, a powerful country especially, which issues debt in its own currency, a currency that it controls, it has a degree of monetary sovereignty, the budget is just what you make it. Money at that level almost isn't real. And we can see that when we compare military spending to education spending or almost any other metric. So is it worth adding to a new updated version of manufacturing consent some kind of economics filter? I don't know. So as you read through this book, I'd have you think about sort of the present situation of reporting especially in the developed world, what kind of filters would you add to manufacturing consent now if it were to be written? As always, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and your takes on this. I think some of the feedback that I've gotten so far has just been fascinating, so I'd be really curious to hear that. We will wrap this lecture up here, and next week we'll be talking about Poland and El Salvador and a couple other things and the way we consider countries worthy or unworthy of our support or our scorn. So I will see you there next week, and thank you, as always, for watching. Thank you.